essentially, this is what it comes down to in achievement goal theory. Mastery versus performance. We know from research that the goals that peers pursue also shape your own goal pursuit.
There's this kind of pressure to publish or perish amongst academics, where citations are your currency, and job prospects, tenure are all on the line based off your citations.
At the end of the day, it comes down to what is my purpose, right? In a certain academic environment.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by Dr. Martin Daumiller to discuss all things achievement goals. Martin is an assistant professor and a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Augsburg, and is also a fellow at the Center for Interdisciplinary Educational Research. Martin's research focuses on motivation in educational settings, and this is the focus of today's discussion. In this episode, we cover which achievement goals are better for performance outcomes, the types of environments that are conducive to student cheating and to unethical practices by researchers, how to set goals for yourself that maximize your success and well-being even in zero-sum environments, and much, much more. If today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College brings value to your life, we would be so grateful if you were to hit share, subscribe, and or follow, as doing this helps us to continue to grow the show and to reach people the world over in providing an accessible, evidence-based resource on mental well-being. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. It means a lot to us. And now to today's discussion with Dr. Martin Daumiller. Before we dive into today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, an important disclaimer. We do dive into the weeds of mental health, which means that at times we discuss sensitive topics like suicide, self-harm, and substance abuse. If hearing such discussion does bring up distress for you, please do seek the psychological and professional treatment that you need. The content covered in this episode is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. All right, Dr. Martin Daumiller, welcome to the Mental Wellbeing College.
Well, thank you for having me.
I hope I pronounced your name right. I didn't even ask you before. Is that how I pronounce it?
That was perfect. Actually, I just had a conversation with someone and they were convinced that my name was French. And they did a very good deal of pronouncing it in French, but German is fine. So in German, we would say Daumiller.
Daumiller, okay. I think it was a decent attempt for a first try. But yeah, welcome to the show. It's great to chat about all things achievement goal theory. I remember when I first when I first came across this, Martin, this was in a third year psych lecture when we were studying Org Psych. They brought up the notion of Locke and Latham's goal setting theory, which sent me down the rabbit hole and eventually got me to achievement goal theory. But I'm curious for you as a prolific researcher in this field, what's your story and journey into this space?
Well, I mean, so I think we got to start by what brought me to research in the first place. And the reason for that, like to some extent at least, was my dad. My dad was a teacher. And, when I was a kid, I was so excited how he managed to reach all of his students. And I think he did a fantastic job. And I was very impressed by that. So that certainly moved me. And another thing was that I also taught myself. So ever since I was 14 years old, I'm giving karate classes in the gym. So it was clear to me that I'm really interested in learning and teaching. And I wanted to do that on a practical level, but also on a theoretical level. So that's what brought me to my undergraduate studies in Augsburg. And first I wanted to become a teacher, but then really diving into the science, psychology and education sciences. That was super exciting for me. And one concept that I found there is the achievement goal concept. And I thought it was super relatable because, you have this focus on mastery and on performance, which is exactly what you find in schools and in educational settings all around. So like intuitively, that made a lot of sense to me. And I thought, well, this is a cool concept to read about and to do research about. It looked pretty clear at first, but once I got into that, I found out about all of the difficulties and all of the challenges that it entails, and that hooked me ever since.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, certainly keen to get into some of those intricacies and technicalities, and hopefully make it as understandable for everyone as possible. But it sounds like you've got a very cool journey from karate to research. And
Yeah.
if we kind of start off the top, Martin, what is an achievement goal? And then if you can, what are the different types of achievement goals?
So maybe there's an example that we could start off with, and that
Yeah.
brings us back to 1911, a long time ago. We had a race to the South Pole. So there was the polar exploration, and we had Robert Scott, who was British, and Roald Amundsen, Norwegian, and they both tried to, make it to the to the South Pole essentially.
Yeah.
But they were quite different in terms of their motivations and quite different in terms of what got them going.
Mm.
So Scott, he wanted to do a career in the Navy, and it would have been
Yeah.
fantastic, to have this achievement. And people wrote about him saying that he could have visited Norway or the Alps. He could have learned to ski and drive dogs himself, or even tried some mountaineering. But he did none of these things. But he very much cared about reputation. And I think it was, one of his colleagues who said that Scott turned the polar exploration into an affair of heroism for heroism's sake.
Uh,
Um, and he didn't make it. And on the way back, he died because of exhaustion. But yeah, if you want to summarize his goals and ambition, you could say, well, this was pretty much about performance, it was about reputation and, what others thought about him. And on the other hand, we have Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, and ever since he's been a kid, he's been very much interested in learning and expeditions and all of that. And his brother wrote about him that he shows a capacity, even a determination to learn from everything that he sees and hears. So he very much cared about these experiences and improving himself. And these sledge excursions, these were super harsh. They were like driving for 8 hours. It was super tough. And he said, well, these excursions were wonderful, and I hope to do many more of them in the future. So he really valued the experience, not as a means to an end, but for the learning experiences that they actually provided. So if we wanted to summarize him in one word, we could possibly say, well, for him, it's about um, learning. So we have performance and we have learning as two quite different approaches. And this race to the South Pole became, one of these classic tales of heroism, ambition, and the human spirit in one of the harshest conditions on Earth. But we can see quite different types of goals if we want to, and that's performance and learning. And this is exactly what achievement goal theory is about. In a different context, it started in the educational realm, but if we look at what kids are being driven in school, then we also find these different foci on mastery, on learning on the one hand, and on performance and what others think about one on the other hand. And essentially, this is what it comes down to in achievement goal theory, mastery versus performance.
so performance goals then are more concerned with what other people think of you and, like you said, your reputation, whereas mastery or learning goals, although I know there's a distinction there, are more concerned with the process itself, the doing itself. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so if we look at the history of achievement goal theory,
Mm.
and this is actually one of the things where you might disagree as a researcher. You could possibly say, well, it's not one single theory because it doesn't come down to one founding father of one founding woman who created the theory, but there has been different people involved in the creation of achievement goal theory. Most notably, we had John Nichols, Carol Dweck, and Carol Ames in the 1980s, and they all really thought about why are students different? Why do they react to failure differently? Why are their self concepts being formed in a different way? And what are the surrounding incentive structures that give rise to that? So these three really thought about goals, but independently from another at first. And
Cool.
this common theorizing then gave rise to achievement goal theory. And this is also one of the reasons that makes it so complicated, because right from the start, you had different ideas and different notions and also different terminology being used. And it took some time for researchers to come to a common understanding of how do we understand goals.
Yeah, as a novice reading through this, it certainly gives this impression that it's changed a lot. There's the 2x2 framework, the 3x2 framework, which I'm sure we'll get into, but it certainly seems like it's changing and moving, and it's not very a unified theory even at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I think this makes it very interesting. It's exciting because you have different ideas, but at the same time, it makes it challenging because at first you see this classic distinction between, let's call it, mastery and performance, and you think, well, this is something that looks relatable to me. I have the same experience when I first stumbled across the theory. But once you get into it and you find the different wordings being used and the different uh, distinctions in definitions and operationalizations. So that makes it really tough to, do your PhD on achievement goals, for instance.
I'm sure a lot of learning throughout those years, and still so by the sounds of it. So we discussed, or I alluded to rather, a 2x2 or a 3x2 framework. It seems like one of the important distinctions is this concept of an approach goal and an avoidance goal, which relate to both the performance and the mastery side of things. Are you able to walk us through a little bit about what that distinction is there?
Yeah. So, as I said, at first we had, Nichols, Dweck, and Ames, and they had different research agendas and different things that they did. But essentially, they made the distinction between two fundamental types of orientations. There's mastery and the performance orientation. And, especially back in the days, but also I think, yeah, maybe this is also something that we could profit from nowadays. Um, there was also this normative philosophical concern about what should we focus on in education. So it's been pretty clear from the start that the focus on mastery and learning, obviously this would be something pretty good. And also this is something that we found in the research, that these mastery concerns, that where you really were interested in improving your own competencies and where you wanted to do tasks right and all of that, this has been quite favorable. But on the other hand, performance goals, that they've been quite inconsistent in terms of empirical findings. It was construed as something that we would wish to avoid because a strong competitive pressure in school may not be good. But empirically, what the researchers found is that sometimes performance goals can even go along with positive processes and sometimes negatives. So that has puzzled researchers. And one solution, and Andrew Elliott is one important name to mention here, was to make this distinction between approach and avoidance goals. So if you're interested in performance, you can say, well, I want to be better than others. I want to make a good impression. That's the target that I'm striving for. I want to get there. And that is performance approach goal. And on the other hand, you can also say, well, I don't want something bad to happen. I don't want to be perceived as incompetent. I don't want others to think that I'm not as skilled as they might think that I am. And then you're trying to avoid something from happening. And that goes along with fears and with worries, and it's holding you back, and it's also associated with negative emotions and all of that. So especially these performance avoidance goals, these are very, very detrimental. But performance approach goals, depending on the circumstances, can be favorable and helpful, at least on the short term. If you have an important exam coming up tomorrow, and if you really want to fully understand the whole material, then maybe that's not as good as just, learning by heart the most important things that you need to pass the exam, in terms of thinking about the upcoming exam. But of course, for long lasting learning processes, these mastery goals are better because they fool you not to give up also when things are challenging and when things are difficult. So on the long run, mastery goals are very, very helpful. But in some occasions, on the short level, the performance goals can also be helpful if you approach them. Avoiding performance, this is consistently been found to be not good.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious. Yeah. Why is that distinction there such that performance avoidance goals are much more detrimental than performance approach goals? Because prima facie, before even reading any of this, my assumption would have been that just performance goals categorically, universally, were going to be detrimental for certain outcomes. But that distinction is really interesting to me. Is there any insight as to why that is the way it is?
So there's different reasons for why that might be the case. One easy suggestion would be to say, well, it depends on your own competence. If you're high in competence, if you think that you're very good, then maybe you want to show your competence. So maybe then you're more prone to pursue performance approach goals. Whereas if you're not thinking of yourself as very competent, then you might rather, pursue the performance avoidance goals. So these different effects might come down to different levels of self-conceptions. This is one easy suggestion for the different results. But what we found is that people can change goals, and you can also manipulate the goals. So you can say to someone, so right now it would be very important for you to really strive after high performance. And then these people might pursue stronger performance approach goals than they typically do. And even in these experimental settings, we still find these distinction in performance approach and performance avoidance goals. And it's not something that is only the case for performance goals. Approach and avoidance motivations are found all over motivational theories. It's something rather old and something that we find all over in the history of psychology, really. And it gives rise to, this promotion, prevention foci and all of that. Our brains just operate differently once we're targeting something that we want to strive after, we want to get it. That's a desirable goal that we're pursuing. But on the other hand, we might, have these performance avoidance goals where we don't want something to happen, and it's less specific and goes along with this, prevention idea. So, different psychological orientations giving rise to different psychological processes.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned, Martin, there then this idea of competence. If you perceive yourself to be less competent, more likely to have a performance avoidance goal. Is there any relationship here between controlling for like baseline competence, and if you control for baseline competence, do you still see the detrimental outcomes of performance avoidance goal orientations towards performance itself, if that's the outcome, like on an exam or whatever,
Yeah,
if you control for baseline competence?
exactly. You can still find that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
The
right.
effects are
Okay.
weaker, but they're still there. So that shows us it's not just,
Mm.
different people either pursuing approach avoidance goals, but it's also the goals themselves that change something in terms of your learning and your attitudes and your interpretation of success at the end of the day.
I'm curious then. So on that note, if we come to the conclusion that performance avoidance goals are particularly detrimental for yourself, do you catch yourself having performance avoidance goals in your own life and then apply that, or how does this translate for yourself overall?
Yeah, sometimes I do. There's this
Yeah.
a thing among researchers in particular, that's the imposter phenomenon. Have you heard about that?
Okay.
The imposter phenomenon. Yeah. And
Not
that's,
not from a researcher point of view.
yeah, but you can also find it, and quite commonly so among researchers,
Yeah.
because, once you're a professor, everyone just thinks that, you should know everything and you're super competent. But at the same time, you might think, well, I'm just like a normal person, and I, I do some research and I read about certain things, but that doesn't make me whatever someone might think I am. So sometimes you find doubting yourselves, and this is pretty common, of course. But
Mm.
if you're overdoing it, you might run the danger of pursuing these performance avoidance goals out of concern that, others might suddenly notice that, whatever
Mm.
they thought about you may not entirely be true. I think it really helps to show that you're just human, and you're a normal person like everyone else. So you don't have to be too perfect. But like, I think all of us run danger, and once in a while we all pursue performance avoidance goals. And there's nothing bad in that, right? We all have goals, and goals are super important because goals and this is why achievement goal theory is a cool theory. Goals are important for motivation. In fact, if you look at definitions of motivations, you will find, well, it's getting people to engage in goal-directed behavior and maintain that. So goals are an inherent part of motivation, and we have different types of goals, and sometimes we also have performance avoidance goals, and this is fine. But really keeping it at the back of your head, and thinking about what goals you're pursuing, and if you often find yourself pursuing performance avoidance goals, then maybe you can try to change that and try to rather focus on performance approach at first. And in the long run, it would be good to really get this long-lasting mastery orientation that fools you to continue studying and performing.
Yeah. So in terms of performance outcomes then that these do predict, Martin, are we talking like grades at university or in schools? Is that what you see when you have, a different constellation of goals that, for example, the mastery goal orientation generally predicts better grades at school versus, say, performance avoidance goals?
Yeah, so the thing with grades is, I mean, yes, this is something that we find, but the effects for grades are not always, very strong and not always very consistent. And this is also a function of how are the grades being determined. And I don't think that we live in this um, ideal world where all of us educational psychologists would like to live in, but we have performance pressure and we have some high stakes, zero sum testing situations. And you do need some performance motivation also to this end. If you're too idealistic and just focus on fully understanding the material, then that's great, but it doesn't necessarily help you to get the best possible grade. You also need some performance goals to this end. Um, but if we look at the learning strategies, then we find that depending on whether you're pursuing mastery goals or performance goals, you tend to use different learning strategies, especially these deep learning strategies, elaborating content, trying to see how does this relate to other things that I know of, what could be examples, how can I use this later in life. These are strategies that are associated with mastery goals. And performance goals rather go along with superficial learning strategies. So you might learn things by heart and very well so, and it can help on the short level, but in the long run, the mastery goals would be much better.
So this is like things like rote learning where you're going to find it more with the performance goals orientation, yeah?
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So one impression I had as well in terms of outcomes, Martin, from reading through your work is the journey itself in terms of the emotional valence, if you like, is much better when you have more of the mastery goal orientation. So this is things like it's positively correlated with more enjoyment, more interest, negatively correlated with boredom and anxiety. So it seems like the journey itself of studying whatever is a lot more enjoyable if you have that more mastery goal orientation.
I could encourage everyone to really focus on the mastery goals. This would be very helpful. And this has been one of the first implications that has been drawn from the classic achievement goal research to put an emphasis on mastery, and not just individuals mastery pursuit, but also the overarching structure in the classroom, not to put too much emphasis on competition and performance, but rather to stress really understanding and learning the learning materials. And there we can see a discrepancy between the ideal motivations that we would like to exist in the classroom and what is possible given the political surroundings.
Well, that's a really good point, right? Like you mentioned this notion of idealistic. How do you go about having more of a mastery goal orientation or avoiding the performance avoidance orientation? Again, not trying to demonize performance goals themselves, because as I understand it, there is nuance there based on what we discussed. But given so many university contexts, educational contexts, zero sum games, for me to get into to be a practicing psychologist, I had to get into an honors program, and there was four people competing for every one spot, and then the funnel became even narrower in the master's program. So How can you go about it, adopting that when you are in that environment that is so, difficult and performance oriented?
So the first step would be to like clearly distinguish between these competitive situations that we have, when you have the exams and when you have the gradings and all of that. So this certainly is a clear performance situation. But on the other hand, there are also situations, and this is especially the case, in high school, where you want to give students the opportunity to make mistakes, to really learn from whatever they're doing. So it would be very, very helpful to say, well, we have two things that can happen in the classroom, and one is a performance situation where it really matters for you to perform because you got to do well in the exam, and we are living in a competitive society. So, this is something that we just have to deal with. But on the other hand, we have clear learning situations and really making a distinction between them and saying, well, now you're not getting evaluated and it's perfectly fine for you to make mistakes now. And indeed, it would even be great if you made mistakes because mistakes are very, very helpful for us. They show us, something that we may not know yet, that they show us different strategies that we could use in the future. So we can actually learn from mistakes, and then making such a helpful learning and error climate in the classroom during these learning situations. This is one very important aspect to facilitate a mastery climate in the classroom. And this is one aspect among multiple aspects. Maybe you've heard about the target model that distinguishes different dimensions, and these are quite broad dimensions. And if you want to instill this helpful mastery climate in the classroom that then informs the individual students in terms of what goals would be helpful for them to pursue, then it's many aspects. Error climate is one aspect, but also, taking care of the students' basic psychological needs, that you feel autonomous, competent, and also in a social relationship with others. Taking care of these basic needs is also very, very helpful to set the foundation for mastery goal pursuits.
It seems like as well, in terms of setting the mastery climate, a lot of that comes from, teachers, university, lecturers, etc. But if we take it one step up in the environments that they operate in, if there's controlling pressures on them to have certain outcomes from their students, then it can be difficult. I imagine, not a teacher myself, but I imagine it can be difficult to adopt a mastery climate if you yourself as a teacher or instructor are operating in more of a competitive zero-sum game climate.
Yeah, this is a very good point. And what we find is there's different levels of motivational surroundings, and you have the individual students, of course, but they also have a family, and their parents have certain expectations, and they have certain ideas of how learning should go along, and these inform the students' motivations too. But then we have a student in a certain peer group, and we know from research that the goals that peers pursue also shape your own goal pursuit, because you're looking at others. We are all social animals, so we look at what others do, and this informs us of what would be appropriate in a certain situation. So the goals of others also shape our goals, and these are peers that I'm dealing often with. But then we have the whole classroom and what all of my fellow classmates are emphasizing at school. And then we have what the teacher does. And then we have the whole school, and the school also has a certain environment. And we know that this also comes down to the policies that are put into place by the headmasters and all of that. And then we have the national policies and all of that. So it's a very complicated, it's a broad system. And we shouldn't just try to tackle one individual student and try to help that person in pursuing better goals. But we have to look at the whole surroundings and try to instill a mastery climate on all levels, essentially, because only then can we get to these meaningful motivations.
Hello everyone, a quick break from today's episode. At the Mental Wellbeing College, we are committed to the goal of communicating evidence-based wellbeing strategies out to the broader community. The goal of this podcast is to bridge a gap between self-help material and peer-reviewed research by providing evidence-based discussion that respects the nuances of psychology but is digestible for all audiences. Ultimately, I hope that you as a listener feel empowered after each episode so that you can take away and implement strategies to improve your own mental well-being. If you have gained value from this episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe or follow, or to share this episode with someone that you love. This is how we continue to grow the show, get the message out, and to impact people in need by providing such information and strategies. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot to us here at the Mental Wellbeing College. And now back to today's episode.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on how the mastery climate is on a broader level here in Australia in the schooling system. And I know that we have standardized testing introduced, national standardized testing in the form of something called the NAPLAN, introduced from, I think, grade 3. So students would be like 8 or 9 at that age, and quite consistent standardized national testing, which gets the schools get ranked and performed against each other, and those ranks are published publicly, and that often informs decisions as to where parents will send their children. So that to me seems quite on a top level, perhaps not a very mastery-oriented climate, more of a performance-oriented climate.
Yeah, I mean, like there are different types of schools that try to do things differently. For instance, that do not do, that do not heavily rely on grades, especially when the kids are young. But these schools maybe only, once the students are supposed to do their A levels, maybe only then grades are being introduced. So you can check what do grades do in terms of students' motivations. And this is something that you do find, but research like that is complicated because, obviously these schools are different in various different ways. And also the people who go to these schools differ. So this is quite complicated in terms of doing research on that.
Yeah. I'm sure the Scandinavians do it well. I'm sure they have a mastery-oriented climate. Just a hunch. No, not that I've seen that in research, but they seem to do everything more egalitarian. So one area that I'm really interested in the application of this, Martin, is health behaviors. I was having a bit of a trawl through. I can't really see achievement goals, applied in that context, but I'm doing my own PhD in that particular area on exercise and health behaviors and how they relate to mental health. Is there any application of achievement goal theory to the health behavior domain or context?
Yeah, and in order to look at that, I think it helps to look at the goals a little bit in more detail, because right now we primarily talked about mastery, performance approach, and performance avoidance goals. And that's a good starting point. But there are way more goals and there are many more distinctions that you can do. So I already alluded to this balance distinction, approach and avoidance, not just being the case for performance goals, but you could do the same thing for mastery goals. You could say, well, I can, approach competence development, and I could say, well, I want to improve my own competencies. I want to do tasks right. I want to master something. But at the same time, you could also say, well, I want to avoid not mastering it. I want to avoid losing competencies. I want to avoid not making the most that would be possible out of a given learning situation. So these would be mastery avoidance goals. And these are, difficult to find, and you could wrap your head around them, and you could see from a conceptual, theoretical point of view why these goals make sense. An open question is, how early can we find them in students, or are they more relevant at the end of one's career, where you're really, struggling with these thoughts of losing competencies and maybe losing things that you once were able to do, but now you're not anymore. But conceptually, at least, we also have these mastery avoidance goals. But then you can also look at the content, and you can say, well, mastery, that involves, the self-standard of doing better than you did in the past. It also includes that thing of, getting better, improving your own competencies. But it also has this task aspect where you just focus on getting the tasks right. how they're supposed to be done. So the standard of judging whether you did right or wrong or well at the end of the day is the task and not so much your own past performance. So we have these distinctions. And the same goes for performance goals. You can also say, well, it's about normatively doing better than others. Or maybe it's just the appearance. Maybe it doesn't matter whether you're actually better than someone else, but the primary concern is what others think about you. And then you also have other additional types of goals, like getting through the day with little effort, work avoidance goals. We often find these in students. And also social goals, where you want to build meaningful and lasting relationships with others. So we have many more goals, and these have been related to well-being. And especially if we look at this distinction between task and learning goals. So task goals are focused on doing tasks right. And you can see how this can be a relief, like I'm a researcher, and as a researcher, we're also often faced with setbacks. You write a big grant proposal and you submit it and you spend months working on it, and lots of things build on that, like another position for your PhD students or whatnot. So high stakes, and then you get rejected once and twice and another time, or you write a great manuscript and you submit it and gets rejected. So we have a lot of setbacks. And if you're very much focused on performance, you can see how this can tear you down and how that can really also harm your own self-concept and your identity as a researcher. And in the worst case, it might give rise to this imposter phenomenon. But on the other hand, if we have these task goals, just focusing on the task itself, this should be pretty straightforward. It should also be less cognitively demanding. Whereas if we have learning goals, we have to think about everything that we could still learn. And it's more complex because every person has their own baseline. So especially these task goals, they should encourage intrinsic motivation and task immersion. And this is very, very helpful in dealing with setbacks and in maintaining your well-being. And what we have found is that these different types of goals, they go along with different levels of subjective well-being. So you're feeling well to a different extent. I've also done research in the sports domain with elite sports athletes. And what we find there, that it also goes along with better objective health. And what we saw is, at least in part, this is due to the different coping strategies that people use. So if you focus on the task at hand, it's easier to use better coping strategies than if yourself is right in the middle of the problem, right? You're concerned with the performance and with others think about yourself. So yourself is right in there, and you're running the danger of harming yourself if you're putting too much emphasis on that.
Yeah, okay. So that brings to mind this notion of kind of threat appraisals, that if you have perhaps more of a performance avoidance orientation, you're more likely to see obstacles as threatening to that outcome versus, say, seeing them as challenges to be overcome, to help my learning, to help my mastery, if you have more of that mastery orientation.
Yeah. And that's especially the case for the performance avoidance goals. So these really go along with that highly perceived threat.
Yeah. Okay. Martin, let's go to some of the juicy and scandalous part of your research, the academic dishonesty as well. So this is a really interesting area of research. How do achievement goals and the different achievement goals that one might have relate to academic dishonesty among students?
Yeah. So we talked about the different correlates that you find for achievement goals, and we talked about learning strategies, and that's one thing. But we also have academic dishonesty, and you could see how it is related theoretically. If you look at mastery goals, if I cheat and I have a mastery goal, I'm missing out on a learning opportunity. So mastery goals should go along with less academic dishonesty. Work avoidance goals, on the other hand, if I want to get through the day with little effort, oh, well then, cheating is helpful because I don't have to do all of the work by myself, but I can find a shortcut. And performance goals, you would think that they should go along with increased academic dishonesty because, again, you know, the performance evaluation is not just based on my own competence, but I'm getting a competitive advantage by, you know, I copied someone else's answers, someone that I didn't know by myself. So now I have an advantage. So you would think that performance goals go along with increased academic dishonesty. And we just did a recent meta-analysis on that. And we find exactly what I talked about for mastery and for work avoidance goals. But for performance goals, we do not find this effect. Sometimes we find that performance goals go along with increased academic dishonesty. Sometimes we do not. So this is something that I'm very curious in. When do these strong performance goals give rise to these detrimental processes, in this case, in terms of academic dishonesty? And we managed to identify a series of contextual features that we can look at and that explain why sometimes these performance goals give rise to more academic dishonesty, but sometimes they do not have the same unfavorable outcomes. And I think this is very, very important in terms of research, because we already talked about the realities in education. And the realities are that we cannot simply say, well, let's just all focus on mastery. Let's get rid of the performance thing. And then we also dealt with the issue of academic dishonesty. This will not be a viable way, but performance concerns will be around. But what we can do is to help students not cheat despite having these strong performance concerns. And, you know, like one aspect, for instance, is that we change how the grading is being done. So we found in research that really helps to focus on the process and not so much the result. So if we evaluate the strategies that people use to answer a certain question, if we look at the process and not just the result, then this leads to performance goals going along with less academic dishonesty. So, well, I can give you an example of the type of research that we did. So we invited students and we said, well, we've developed this novel academic attitude, this novel academic test, and we want to see, you know, how well this test works. And the students were coming in, and then half of the students we taught, well, right now it really matters that, you know, it should be done under authentic circumstances. So it really matters that you strive after high performance. You should do your best job and really try to impress us, because like this is what the test is about. And the other half of the students weren't told that. And what we found then, we asked them about their goals right afterwards. What we found is that we managed to manipulate the performance goals. So half of the students had high performance goals. The other had, you know, regular levels of performance goals. So, you know, that was the starting point. But once the students began on working on their tasks, then the examiner received an important phone call. It was very urgent, and they had to leave the room. And we set up the room in a way that the students would always see the examiner coming back. So they were unobserved, seemingly, and they had opportunities to cheat because once the examiner left, he forgot the sheet with the correct solutions on his desks, and all of the students saw that.
Nice. Yeah.
And then we can, you know, change various ways. One thing that we changed is whether one fellow student, a Confederate student, looked at these solutions or not. So there we try to manipulate some social norm. And the other thing that we manipulate is how did we tell the students that the performance would get evaluated, whether it's, you know, the strategies that they're using or solely whether they got, you know, the answers correct or not. So that's the second factor then. And what we find typically in these settings is that, what would you think? How many students cheat in such a situation?
Well, look, I've read this study with both of these studies with Stefan Janke. I think is how you said Janke. Yeah. So I know what happens, but
okay.
yeah. So my understanding is that those in the where they see someone else cheat and who are on the focus is on the outcome rather than the process, those are the ones who are more likely to cheat themselves. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's what we find. You're very well prepared. You don't need me for the podcast, I see that. But what we found is that about 1 in 3 students cheats, first of all. And that is 1 in 3 students in both the control condition, where they don't have any performance goals and where no one else is cheating. But it's also about 1 out of 3 students where we only have the performance goals and not any of the other things. But it's also one
Okay.
out of 3 students where we do not have performance goals, but let's say the social norm that others are cheating as well, or that the result is being evaluated and not the process. But only if both come together, high performance goals and putting emphasis on evaluating the results or having other students there that you might think cheat as well. Only if these things come together, then it's about 2 in 3 people cheating. So it's almost doubling the cheating rate in this situation. Um, so through such experiments, we found
Yeah.
out that we can change the surrounding context in order to
Yeah.
alleviate these detrimental effects that performance goals can have.
And this seems to come back to what you were saying earlier, Martin, about, okay, in an academic environment, there's always going to be performance requirements around students come to exam time. But if in before that, if in the gaps between those, you instill more of a mastery oriented climate and have things focus more on the process rather than social comparisons of outcomes, of exam marks, that you're going to create less of an environment than the environment that you had in the experiments where it was more likely to influence cheating behaviors.
Yes, yes, yes. And also, if we get the environment just right, then we can try to avoid these negative processes given rise by the personal motivations that the students might hold by themselves already. So the environment is not only helpful to mitigate academic dishonesty, but also to nuance the effects that the personal motivations might have.
Yeah, yeah. And then you've applied this as well, Martin, to actual academics and done a lot of work there in terms of questionable research practices and the environment there. I mean, you'd be able to give much better insight than I do, but there's this kind of pressure to publish or perish amongst academics where citations are your currency and job prospects, tenure are all on the line based off your citation. So can you give us a bit of an insight into the environmental pressures there and how they may feed into the goal orientations and ultimately questionable research practices?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've already seen, how the pressure increases over the course of one's academic career. And you said, in your master's program, it's been pretty competitive. And at the end of the day, you get, compared to the others, and it matters who's got the best grades at the end of the day. And the same is the case in academia, unfortunately. We have a highly competitive climate. People are competing, especially in Germany, on very few tenured positions. So, you really got to be the best of the best, and it really matters to have, many publications, third-party funding, and all of that. So you could see how this matters for professors and for researchers. So there's an inherent pressure, even let's call it pressure, to have a high research output. And there is a motivation there to, yeah, let's focus on the performance. And you could see why even researchers with strong performance goals might, sometimes be prone to also using certain shortcuts. So it's not them, saying, well, I'm going to cheat now, I'm going to fake data. Some do that. We have rare cases where people really, fake the whole research essentially. Um, but much more dangerous is the use of questionable research practices, where you say, well, there might be a good reason to continue data collection. I planned to stop at a sample of 180, but well, I haven't found the results yet. So, there might be this and that. So let's continue going. And you stop once you have a certain result. Or you could say, well, looking back, I might have had an hypothesis on this. So instead of using a two-tailed significant level, let's use a one-tailed
Mm.
significance level. So, these are these things that you can do, questionable research practices, that you shouldn't do, of course. But especially
Mm.
under this strong performance climate, people might sometimes be more prone to, use these things. And it depends on how they're being socialized, of course. It depends on the surrounding
Mm.
standards. It depends on what the others do. But what we have found is that in such settings, and we did this research with faculty members, their performance
Mm.
goals can give rise to an increase in academic dishonesty. And we also
Mm.
found that the same ideas of certain factors nuancing these effects, we also found this in faculty members. But most of my research
Mm.
on that has unfortunately been on students. We'd like to do much more research on faculty and questionable research practices, but this is
Yeah.
a very sensitive topic, and uh,
Yeah.
not too many researchers like to participate in this type of research.
Yeah, understandably so. Yeah. Well, okay, given all these, wonderful and not so wonderful and more sinister outcomes that we've spoken about, and it seems that generally speaking, in most contexts, having a mastery goal orientation is more beneficial from a performance and from an emotional journey point of view. What are actionable ways that people who are listening, who maybe identify with more of the performance side of things as their goal orientations, what are some actionable ways in which that they can change that constellation to more of a mastery goal oriented constellation? Again, recognizing that, like you said, there are some instances where performance approach goal orientation can come in handy.
So if we take this individual approach, where you are concerned about your goals now, first of all, think about your own goals. Most of the times we do not. Goals are cognitively accessible, but they may not always be, an active, conscious representations that we are, actively dealing with. So it really helps to think about your own goals and think about, what is driving you, and see how this is working out for you. And if you say, well, I'm caring a lot about performance, then this may be fine. First of all, it depends on the context, and it may be working out quite well for you. But then in the next step, think about approach and avoidance. So if you're having these avoidance concerns, then this might be something to tackle. And instead of pursuing performance avoidance goals, maybe you can change them around to focus on performance approach goals. You got to think what is holding you back, right? So what are the worries? Are you know, what are the worries that are occupying you, that, prompt you to say, well, I don't want something to think negatively about myself, or I don't want to do worse than others. If you can identify these points, it might be much easier to say, well, instead of avoiding poor performance, I can focus on, achieving high performance. So, you can keep the performance focus, but instead of the avoidance concerns, try to change it to the approach goals. And at the same time, work on the mastery goals. Find something interesting, right? There's this task and you have to do it anyway. And maybe you have to do it because you want to do well. If you want to have a high performance at the end of the day, this is fine. But at the same time, try to make it interesting. Uh, Find out how can you use this later on in your life. Make it a challenge to work on your own skills and to have fun doing so. So you can try to find ways that help you build that mastery motivation that is so helpful, especially in the long run.
That's an important point, right? So almost alluding to the fact that trying to make it as intrinsically enjoyable as possible, the process itself, because it's difficult to have a mastery orientation if it's just so dry and you don't want to engage in it at all. There's no motivation to do so.
Yeah, yeah. At the end of the
Mm.
day, it comes down to what is my purpose, right? In a
Mm.
certain
Mm.
academic environment, and if you think,
Mm.
well, my purpose is to learn something new and to improve myself, then this is
Mm.
very valuable, and you can work on that by yourself.
Mm.
But it also is a function of the context, as we already talked about, and we
Mm.
know that the motivations that teachers have for themselves also inform the motivations of the students. Teachers,
Mm.
for once, they're role model, so they can say, well, you made a mistake. This is fantastic, great. This is a learning opportunity for all of us. And this helps to build these mastery goals. Whereas if you said, well, you made a mistake, this is bad, the other students are doing much better than you, then this instills this competitive focus. So also when we're dealing with other people, emphasizing mastery goals as a purpose for what we're supposed to be doing in a certain context, this would be very, very helpful. And, engaging with others in a mastery climate, this would be very good in terms of these achievement motivations.
Oh, fantastic, Martin. That seems very actionable and accessible in terms of being aware of who your role models are and what influence they're having with their own goal orientations, but also yourself, and reflecting on, what are the triggers for your own performance avoidance goals as well. So yeah, very accessible. Is there anything, finally, Martin, that you wanted to share with listeners on the show?
We talked about goals, right? And you started off with goal setting theory. So this is a different approach. In goal setting theory, you can try to formulate smart goals. You make your goals specific and measurable and all of that. And this is very, very helpful. And looks at the formulation of the goals itself. Whereas here in achievement goal theory, we're more looking at the content. What are the goals about that you're pursuing? But at the end of the day, all of our goals are very, very important. We couldn't be motivated without goals, and our lives wouldn't be good if we had no goals to pursue after. So really thinking about your goals and trying to get a grasp on your goals, and ideally, trying out goals that are working better for you and formulating them in a way that makes it easier to attain them. I think this is a very important skill to have, especially in contexts where we are faced with so many things that we're supposed to be doing and that we could possibly do all at the same time. So I think this makes it even the more important to think about your goals and not to lose sight of them.
Oh, fantastic, Martin. Yeah, very sage advice, and again, very accessible for people to go ahead and just think and reflect on their own goals. Certainly reading through this own literature in my own experience preparing for our conversation has certainly actually made me look in the mirror at my own goals and helped iterate some actions where I've recognized, having a bit more of a performance avoidance orientation there. How can I shift that? So I certainly hope and anticipate it'll be a similar experience for people listening.
Yeah. I think it's very relatable to all of us, and it's what we find all over in education, really. In each educational setting, we have achievement situations where both learning and performance matter, and you got to navigate your way through these terrains somehow. And if you manage to do so better by having a good goal pursuit, then I think you're off to a much better life with better academic success, but also health, right? We talked about subjective well-being as a function of goal pursuit as well. So it's not just doing well academically, but it's also feeling well and being happy with the results.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College. If you've made it this far, it means you've gleaned a ton of value from today's episode, or you've fallen asleep. I sincerely hope that it's the former, and if it is, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you care about. Our mission here at the Mental Wellbeing College is to provide a free and accessible resource for people to take action and implement to improve their own mental wellbeing. And you subscribing, following, and or sharing helps us to achieve that mission and to impact people in need. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot. We'll see you next week on the Mental Wellbeing College.